I'd like to pick up now on some of the points that were just made by Maria as a prelude to our first panel today, which is on strengthening workers' voice in EU company law and whether it is on the agenda of the EU company mobility package. So, as we heard just now, and as we also discussed yesterday, both in the keynote and in the first workshop on workers' voice, EU company law is perhaps the most crucial determinant of whether and how workers' voice gets heard. Over the past 5 years, the general trend in the development of this body of law has been toward deregulation, with implications that tend to suppress rather than widen opportunities for participation and/or co-determination. So before we begin our first panel, I would like to just quickly take a look back at some of the key decisions and instruments that have shaped the current framework and will be shaping it going forward. And essentially, this is the look back as to how we got where we are today in terms of Wednesday's publication by the Commission of the Company Mobility Package. So I want to first take us back to 2014. And you will remember, ladies and gentlemen, that it was the explicit aim of the Single European Act to foster cross-border economic activity. That process isn't yet completed, and several of the steps designed to implement it certainly have adverse implications for the core institutions that give workers a voice, and the trade unions have been very diligent in pointing that out. So we go back to 2014 when the EU Commission proposed the SUP, the Single Member Private Limited Liability Company, and you will probably remember the discussions that we had here in Brussels at the European Dialogue in that year and in general, with stakeholders, including the trade unions, strongly criticizing the SUP, and of course also very controversial debate in the European Parliament. And it's just worth mentioning this and remembering back to 2014 because some of the issues that came up at that time, for example, the concern about split seats, that companies could use the construction of an SUP in order to shop around for the most favorable legal frameworks for their operations. That was something that came up at that time, and it remains an abiding concern now. And now we fast forward to last year, and the Commission's initiative announced at that time on company law. And once again, this initiative was intended to facilitate cross-border mergers and restructuring in the sense that we discussed it yesterday, namely conversions, including the transfer of corporate seats, as well as it was also an effort to make it easier to register companies digitally. And again, in the course of public consultations on the new package last year, trade unions and other stakeholders expressed alarm about the potential implications of the new package, saying that it would create manifold opportunities for legal and institutional arbitrage by companies seeking to maximize short-term profits by finding the most favorable legal and institutional regime available. So the stakeholders' objections revolved around two sets of concerns. Risks not only for processes of participation and co-determination, but also risks for consumers, for minority creditors, and for employees. And let's take a more detailed look very quickly at various aspects of the package and various risks that the commenters were concerned about. So the directive on cross-border conversions could make it easier, many said, for corporations to transfer their seat of business without substantial economic activity in the country of destination. In other words, the country that they were ostensibly moving their seat to, thereby enabling companies to cherry-pick locations and choose tax and labor law havens in order to avoid regulation, including, of course, worker participation rules. Objections have also been raised to the Directive on Corporate Division on the grounds that it could be abused by companies seeking to appear leaner in order to undercut numerical thresholds for workers' board-level representation. So again, an opportunity essentially for evasion and obfuscation on the part of firms. Now, as noted, one of the primary goals of the new initiative has been to foster the use of digital tools, 4.0, as was mentioned a moment ago. There was concern that digital registration without notarial control could open the door to misrepresentation and evasion, facilitating the creation of letterbox companies that would, of course, then be used for social dumping, and which would subvert the effects of a prior revision of the Posting Workers Directive. A first analysis, as we heard yesterday and as we will now discuss in more detail in our first panel, a first analysis of the new EU Commission company law proposal that was released on Wednesday indicates that this particular concern has been taken into consideration, at least in part. To what degree that assuages the potential for regulatory arbitrage is something that we want to take up now shortly in our first panel, but it is interesting to see that there apparently was some movement on this particular point in the new proposal. And just a last couple of points. A fourth aspect of the package that has, oops, I'm a slide ahead here, but a fourth aspect of the package that has come in for criticism is the proposal to harmonize conflict of law rules. Critics say that this could undermine accountability by making it more difficult to hold companies incorporated in one member state liable in another, even when their main activity takes place there. So very big concerns as well about accountability issues. So in sum, the approach to date has reflected ambivalence about widening workers' voice or widening opportunities for participation and co-determination. So far, the approach has tended to be one that takes shareholder value as the main standard for corporate governance. That's something we talked about yesterday. And that tends to settle on the least common denominator amongst Europe's diverse corporate law traditions when it comes to consultation and participation. But, and certainly this will also be something we want to take up now in the discussion, and it was something raised yesterday as well, the EU can do better. Why not consider a paradigm change, a true paradigm change to a new corporate governance standard, which is simply a sustainable company for all. That kind of a standard could make EU company law a catalyst for a more social Europe. Again, a point that has been made by a number of speakers here at this year's European Dialogue. It could widen channels for participation and co-determination, and thereby could foster socially responsible corporate management that promotes not only a fairer distribution of economic gains, but also societal stability that makes companies an agent for a more social Europe. And that, talking about how we might get there, that is also one of the issues that we want to raise now in our first panel discussion of the day. So I would like to ask the panelists to please join me on stage. And I think our lingua franca in this panel is going to be German. So I'm going to switch languages again. Thanks very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.